Good morning, everyone. I'm Dr. J.C. Buckner, 2021 Chair of the Tri-Society IDEA Award Committee. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce today's speaker and the 2021 recipient of the IDEA Award, Dr. Adriana Briscoe. Dr. Briscoe was nominated for the IDEA Award for her, quote, advocacy and mentorship of BIPOC and Latinos at all levels of professional development in ecology and evolutionary biology, including advocating for increased funding for BIPOC teacher training in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Dr. Briscoe has prepared a wonderful narrative about people, place, and privilege that I believe beautifully illustrates her standing on issues of identity, inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. So for this introduction, I'll focus on familiarizing you with the scientist and scholar, our fellow evolutionary biologist and respected colleague. Dr. Briscoe received bachelor's degrees with honors in philosophy and biology, as well as a master's degree in philosophy from Stanford. She then went on to earn her PhD in biology from Harvard. After 2 brief postdocs at the University of Arizona and the University of Colorado Health Sciences Center, where she was a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellow, she joined the faculty at the University of California, Irvine, where she is currently a full professor in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. Her research focuses on sensory physiology, molecular evolution, and genomics using butterflies as a model system. More specifically, her lab examines how natural selection shapes the primary amino acid sequence of proteins and leads to changes in physiology and behavior, specifically in the interaction between color vision and wing coloration. Her work has been published in journals like PNAS, Molecular Biology and Evolution, Genetics, Proceedings of the Royal Society B, Evolution, American Naturalist, Current Biology, and Molecular Ecology. In recognition of her contributions to science, Dr. Briscoe was an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Royal Entomological Society, the California Academy of Sciences, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and most recently, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Her mentees have been recipients of NSF, Ford, and National Geographic Fellowships, among other awards, and several are now faculty at various institutions. She has also been, quote, instrumental in hiring of Latinx faculty in her own department at UC Irvine. In popular media, Dr. Briscoe's work on butterfly vision has been featured in NPR Shortwave, The New Scientist, and PBS Nova. Her work has also been featured in the LA Times, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and National Geographic. She has also shared her experiences as a researcher through the beloved Story Collider. Look for her episode entitled One Step Closer to the Rocky Mountains. Recently, Dr. Briscoe has been honored with the Distinguished Scientist Award from the Society for the Advancement of Chicanos, Hispanics, and Native Americans in Science. She also received the University Faculty Award from the American Association of Hispanics in Higher Education. All of these honors and achievements are a testament to her success as both a scientist and a mentor. So without further ado, Dr. Adriana Briscoe.
Good morning, everyone. I wish Janet was here so I could thank her in person for that great introduction. And I want to just say that it's really humbling to hear my accomplishments listed out like this. And yet, it's taken me a very long time to get here. And I did not get here on my own. When I think back on my journey that I've been on, the first memory I might have had might have been of this one teacher. She was actually an actress named Joanne Cameron who played a high school science teacher by day, and the Egyptian goddess Isis by night in a show that ran from 1975 to 1977. And I say this a bit tongue-in-cheek because it was around this time, when I was about the age of 7, that I drew this picture, the self-portrait, that said, when I grow up, I want to be a scientist. And that is my earliest recorded memory of the career path I wanted to be on. It was at this moment of seeing a science teacher role model on television that probably sparked that inspiration. I didn't know any actual scientists as a child, and seeing this drawing makes me think about how someone like me, a cisgendered Mexican-American woman of European, indigenous Mexican, and Native American descent, became a scientist despite unlikely odds. In the US, people of Mexican origin are the largest minority group, comprised of 36 million individuals, or 11% of the US population. In California currently, 55% of our K through 12 students identify as Hispanic or Latinx. Yet, in our field of ecology and evolutionary biology, only 2 to 5% of faculty across all ranks nationally are Latinx. And this is unfortunate because research has shown that having a teacher as a role model increases student retention for students of color. Even a single teacher, and especially in middle school. And for me, seeing a woman science teacher role model, superhero, on television early sparked that inspiration, just like seeing science teacher role models in school does for so many people who have them. So given that I grew up in California, I went to a high school with in a low-income Latino community with a high dropout rate. How did I become a science professor? What kinds of obstacles did my family have to overcome to make it possible for me to be where I am today? And what kinds of advantages did I have? Well, it comes down to three things: Familia, or family; comunidad, community; maestros, or teachers. My career as a scientist wouldn't have been possible without all three. And some of the family history I'm going to share with you, I only learned recently, within the past 5 years. If I had known some of that history early in my career, including some Mexican and Mexican-American history, I probably would have felt more empowered as a student and held less negative stereotypes about myself and my community. So, the first thing you need to know about me is that I come from a family of teachers. I've already mentioned Mighty Isis, but before Mighty Isis was my mother, Loretta Mejia. She put herself through community college, as did my father, Peter Briscoe, and then she transferred to the University of California, Riverside. In 1965, she was one of 3 Spanish surnamed undergraduates and the only woman out of 76 from San Bernardino County, the largest county in the US, to graduate from the University of California, Riverside, a school that is now a Hispanic serving institution. When she was at UCR, she was co-founder of MECHA, or Movimiento Estudiantil Chicanx de Aztlán, an organization promoting higher education, community engagement, political participation, culture, and history. And she was the editor-in-chief of the student newspaper Adelante. After my mother graduated, she began teaching 3rd grade as an intern teacher in an elementary school that was one of the first segregated schools in the region, which was built for Mexican students in the 1920s. My father, Peter Briscoe, a graduate of UC Riverside, directed the Dependency Prevention Commission's Barrio tutoring program until right before he married my mother. His program's tutors helped teach reading and math to hundreds of Black and Latino students, including 24 illiterate adults. My parents strongly believed that literacy developed around the regular reading of newspapers and books formed the basis of civic engagement and a path out of the barrio for people of color. Both my parents were first-gen community college students prior to going to university, and both came from working-class families, which made me wonder how they managed to graduate from college. It turns out that my mother's mother, Consuelo Lozano, did something amazing as a high school student that paved the way for my mother's subsequent educational attainment. My grandmother attended school in a segregated school district and as a high school student experienced food insecurity. Yet she persevered, unlike the handful of other Mexican girls she had started high school with. Most of the Mexican kids she had gone to middle school with had to drop out of work because of the Great Depression. She graduated from Colton High School in 1937. She was the only Spanish surnamed woman to graduate in a class of 110 students in a district with hundreds of Mexican school kids. To appreciate my grandmother's accomplishment, you need to know that people of Mexican descent living in the US have long faced discrimination in wages, housing, and school. As one example, in 1931, the principal of the Lemon Grove Grammar School in San Diego County, California, stood at the door and admitted all pupils except the Mexican students. He announced the Mexican children did not belong at the school, could not enter, and instructed them to attend a two-room building constructed just for them. Dejected, embarrassed, and angry, the Mexican children left the school and returned home. And these kinds of events were quite common in the US. So, given all the hurdles my grandmother faced, it made me curious how she survived long enough to graduate from high school that had only 2 other students of Mexican descent in her graduating class. She had a deep admiration for education, and in her 60s, after her children had grown up and left the house, she went back to school, she went to college, she earned a teaching credential, and became a bilingual elementary school teacher, which I think is amazing. I didn't really appreciate where her inspiration to become a teacher came from until I started looking into her family a few years ago. And I learned that my mother's side of the family emigrated to the US from Michoacan, Mexico, between the years of 1898 and 1905. They'd been living on a hacienda located on the ancestral lands of the Purepecha indigenous people. Haciendas were large estates with fields and livestock worked by poor people and owned by individual wealthy landowners. I was astonished to learn that one tremendous advantage that my grandmother had was that her grandfather, my great-great-grandfather, Luis Hernandez, was a literate man who taught all of his children how to read and write in Spanish. And he was also a teacher on the hacienda. So even though my grandmother in California went to a school in a segregated school district where most kids like her simply dropped out because they were poor, she had a Mexican teacher role model of her own who sparked her motivation to persevere despite daunting odds. And when I was growing up and going to high school, I was really, really bothered by the large number of my classmates, my fellow Latinx classmates, that were continuing to drop out 50 years after my grandmother attended the same school. And I'm a little ashamed to admit it, but as a young person, I held a lot of negative stereotypes about why this was happening. Gangs, drugs, violence, teen pregnancy. It was only when I began to look into Mexican and Mexican American history did I have a better understanding of the economic circumstances, the intentional labor exploitation, the political and reproductive disenfranchisement, and the grinding poverty, which made it so difficult for young people in my community to do basic things that we hold dear in the US, like graduate from high school and go to college. So I want to share a glimpse of that history with you so you have a better understanding of how deeply embedded US interests have been in Mexico, which has driven so much migration to this country, and which has also made it difficult for Latinx people to pursue higher education, and why role models are so important. While my family was living on the hacienda, conditions were changing in rural Mexico in a way that deeply affected my family's life. This period corresponds to the rule of the Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz. During the 1800s, Diaz gave subsidies to US and European businessmen, paid for by the taxes of the lower classes in Mexico. He gave these subsidies to US and European businessmen who had backed his armed ascent to power. These investors grabbed land, displacing indigenous peoples, and built railroads throughout Mexico. By 1900, 25% of arable land, farmable land in Mexico, and about 80% of railroads were owned by US investors. This accelerated the mass movement of agricultural goods and laborers to US and European markets, while at the same time, domestic agricultural food production declined. However long and tirelessly my family worked on the hacienda, the rents and costs were such that they, like most landless people, stayed mired in poverty. Instead of paying workers in pesos, many hacienda owners actually printed their own paper money in arbitrary denominations. And here's an example from the hacienda my family worked in. It reads, comprobante de media tarea, or voucher for half a job. And you can imagine how much work corresponded to half a job was an arbitrary amount of work decided by the overseers. And you can imagine how rife with abuse the system must have been. These vouchers could only be used in the hacienda store. And the owner of the hacienda was able to make back all of the wages that he paid out each year to the farmers by selling them goods at elevated prices, which they had no other choice to buy than in this store. So once you accumulated debt as a tenant farmer, even if you died, your debt would be passed on to your children. They would have to be responsible for paying it after you died. These were extremely difficult circumstances in which to live. So my great-great-grandfather Luis left Michoacan and headed north in 1898. And I was able to find an immigration card to the US for his son Raimundo, who crossed over to the US in El Paso, Texas. Their decision to leave Mexico was not unusual. To support their families, thousands of men from Michoacan became migrant farm workers in California. And what was going on at the border in El Paso, Texas in the late 1800s, I think, is still relevant, even now, to the ethical practice of science. Reading Maria Hinojosa's book recently, I was horrified to learn that in El Paso, Mexican workers, both men and women, were routinely subjected to full body inspections, to vinegar and kerosene baths, and toxic fumigations using DDT, a now banned pesticide. And from 1917 onwards, and 1929 onwards, Zyklon B gas until the 1950s. Photographs of these procedures were published in international newspapers and in a German science journal. And Nazis, inspired by what they saw in El Paso, Texas, adopted Zyklon B gas in their gas chambers to not just fumigate clothes, but to kill people during the Holocaust. For me, this is one of the most poignant examples of the use and abuse of science. Science is not neutral or objective in of itself, and that is why we need people of color, LGBTQIA+, two-spirited, disabled people who are accountable to other marginalized people in positions of oversight to try to prevent these horrific abuses. My family was unquestionably subjected to this treatment as they crossed the border in El Paso, Texas, to visit relatives many times, although they never spoke of it. 750 miles from El Paso is the town of Colton. Let me tell you a little bit more about that place, because that's where I grew up. My family settled in an ethnically segregated Mexican and Mexican-American community within Colton, a place that had been home to Mexicans since the time of Spanish rule. They settled less than a mile from the cement plant shown here in this picture. However, by settling in Colton, my great-great-grandfather moved himself and later his sons from one system of US and European labor extraction, the hacienda, to another, the citrus industry and the cement plant. Unfortunately for my family and tens of thousands of other Mexican immigrants, the work they were able to find in the US, like that in Mexico, was typically a dead-end type of employment. They were, in fact, intentionally excluded from supervisory roles. They could not move up in our system. With the deck stacked against them as it was, people in my community got stuck in generational poverty, which scholars have shown is nearly impossible to escape from, regardless of the capacity and motivation of the individuals involved. So we need to be aware of these struggles and talk about them in approaching STEM education, especially for first-generation students. For example, one of the people in my family who had to drop out of school to work in the orange groves due to poverty was my grandfather, Sebastian Mejia, shown on the right. Sebastian Mejia was born in Mexico and was brought to New Mexico in 1915 by his parents when he was 2 years old. I note that Mexican border crossers were not considered illegal in the US until 1917 during World War I. Along with hundreds of thousands of men of Mexican descent and women, my grandfather fought in the army during World War II. Prior to that war, my grandfather, like thousands of other Mexicans, was an agricultural worker at the Pacific Fruit Express, loading citrus on trucks. So, as the granddaughter of farm workers, I think about the status of agricultural workers in the US, particularly because these are the people who feed us before the pandemic, during the pandemic, continue to feed us. And at the same time, these are the people most hard hit by wildfires and COVID in California. These are people who pay into our system taxes, but because a majority are undocumented, are denied basic social services like health and social security. And if you read the scholarship of historians like Kelly Lytle Hernandez, you will learn that the system of labor extraction and exploitation and the disenfranchisement of Mexican workers by U.S. agribusiness is, in fact, by design. But it doesn't need to be that way. We can be a more just and inclusive society. Agricultural workers underpin the $1.1 trillion agricultural industry in the US. Currently, there are 2.5 to 3 million agricultural workers. 75% are foreign born. 69% are born in Mexico. 6% are born in Central America. Many come from indigenous communities. They do not speak Spanish, but they bring their indigenous knowledge of food production with them to help feed us. So, given what I've told you, you can imagine how shocked I was in 2019 to go to the local San Bernardino County Museum, my community's museum, to view a brand new exhibit on the regional history of the citrus industry, and to notice there was no mention of Mexican or Mexican-American farm worker participation, none. There was only one sentence in this huge exhibit which vaguely mentioned Latinos as non-residents, even though people of Mexican origin had been living in this area since before California was part of the United States. It was shocking to me that the lived experience of thousands of Mexicans who labored in the citrus groves, including 2 generations of my family, was totally erased. This is, a really simple, basic, straightforward fact. Gone. So for related reasons, I do not want to contribute to the erasure of scientists from the global South. So when I collect specimens and conduct research with Mexican scientists and other scientists from Latin America, I invite them to be co-authors on resulting publications so as to appropriately acknowledge their local knowledge of the biology of the organisms I'm studying. Some of my most important papers have come from these collaborations. For example, in 2009, Jorge Lorente Bosquets, a professor at UNAM in Mexico City, took me and his students to his study site in a rainforest in Oaxaca, Mexico, where we collected butterflies that coexist in mimetic communities. By measuring the spectral properties of the yellow coloration on their wings, we noticed the switch to a new chemical yellow in butterflies of the genus Heliconius also corresponded to the evolution of a duplicated UV photoreceptor in their eyes. And using modeling, we subsequently showed that this new kind of yellow coloration could serve as both a signal to differentiate potential mates from other butterfly species in a community of mimics, and also as a warning color to avian predators. So, given the place I grew up in, it took me a very long time to understand that some of the negative stereotypes I carried around with me about being Mexican American had a lot to do with the political climate in California and in the US in general towards Latinos and people of Mexican descent in particular. For example, in 1994, California restricted access to healthcare and education, so public schools, to undocumented immigrants. In 1996, it banned affirmative action. In 1998, California banned bilingual education. Remember, both my mother and my grandmother were bilingual elementary school teachers in California, so this affected me directly. Throughout the entire 90s, anti-Black and anti-Brown legislation passed in California. But since then, by learning more about Mexican and Mexican American history and how US economic interests drove the political instability leading up to the Mexican Revolution, which in turn drove my family's journey to the US, my thinking about my community, its challenges, and its educational potential has changed. I realized I am where I am because I had teachers that were role models, including teachers in my own family. And that was a missing part of the puzzle of my own educational attainment. So as one example, in second grade, I had a Mexican-American teacher, Mrs. Gloria Preder. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of her, but what she did was act on an IQ test I had been administered in kindergarten, and she advocated to accelerate me into the third grade. And although skipping a grade is now discouraged as not being good for students socially or emotionally, in retrospect, my teacher's action was a stroke of good luck, because 42% of schools nationwide did not identify a single student with gifts and talents in 2015 or 2016. And among those schools with programs for such students, Native American, Black, and Latinx students were underrepresented. And as sociologist Glenda Flores has argued, teachers of color can sometimes serve as indispensable advocates for minority students that would otherwise be overlooked. So I was fortunate to skip a grade, thanks to Mrs. Gloria Prater, because it put me into Miss Jaca's classroom. And unfortunately, I don't have a picture of her either. Miss Jaca volunteered at the La Brea Tar Pits in the summer and brought to class a saber-toothed cat fang we were allowed to handle. And she taught us the scientific names of dinosaurs by having us learn dinosaur songs played on a record player. It was one of my first memories of being exposed to the concept of geological time and evolution, and it became a lifelong passion. So related to this, as educators, there's a lot we can do to leverage our expertise to help teachers. For one thing, we can facilitate access to specimens and science materials. For example, my colleague, Dr. Rachel Martin in UCI's chemistry department, has partnered with the Corona Public Library to distribute physics and biology kits with step-by-step instructions, both in Spanish and English. Even for people who don't know any Spanish, there are, in fact, easy-to-use online translation programs available. So something as simple as offering a Spanish translation of a science experiment and posting it online can open the doors of a career in STEM for English learner students. I want to share one more story about another teacher when I was in middle school, and his name was Dr. Dorman Campbell. He was my 8th grade social sciences teacher, and he also had a huge impact on my life. His father-in-law, Dr. Bruce Halstead, ran a private zoological institute. Dr. Halstead was an ichthyologist and one of the world's experts in the medical consequences of being bitten, shocked, stung, or otherwise poisoned by marine animals. His private research institute had a youth science program run by Mr. Campbell. And in this program, Dr. Halstead recreated for us tasks he did when he was a teenager working at the California Academy of Sciences, like maintaining a collection of ethanol-preserved marine organisms. More than 30 years later, to my surprise and delight, as you heard in the introduction, the California Academy of Sciences, which had greatly influenced Dr. Halstead in his youth, elected me a fellow. I wish he was still alive so I could share that with him. I'm extremely grateful to this unusual, far-sighted family which opened the doors of science to me. And surveys of women who, like me, participated in science enrichment programs as 8th graders suggest that these programs can lead to higher than average rates of enrollment in four-year universities, and also they can increase the interest and boost the self-confidence of these women that they could succeed in science. At the university and in graduate school, I was fortunate to have had phenomenal women scientist teacher role models. Professor Carol Boggs, along with her husband, Professor Ward Watt, introduced me to the wonders of fieldwork at the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab. I've talked about this a bit on NPR and in my Story Collider talk. And in graduate school, my PhD co-advisor, Professor Naomi Pierce, taught me how to build a dynamic research group, how to collaborate with others in a thoughtful way, and provided me unwavering support for my dissertation study of butterfly vision, a subject which my lab continues to study today. So, fast forward a few years past graduate school, I was the first Latina hired in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of California, Irvine, nearly, my gosh, 20 years ago. UCI, as of 2017, is now a Hispanic serving institution, meaning it has an enrollment of 25% Latinx students. Yet, in 2014 through 2019, only 6% of my upper division students, my honors students and upper division students, had Spanish surnames. I was not surprised at this, unfortunately, because Latina women are among the most underpaid in the United States, while the parents of scientists have higher incomes than even the parents of doctors. In addition, 1 in 5 people in the state of California is Latina, and Latinas in California earn only 42 cents for each dollar a white man is paid. Over a 40-year period, the average wage gap for Latina women is $1.7 million, which, in the words of Beatriz Acevedo, Chief Executive Officer and co-founder of Summa Wealth, will, quote, in turn rob America of trillions of dollars in taxes that they would otherwise be contributing to pay for schools, urban infrastructure, parks, hospitals, Social Security, and so forth. So when Latinos get paid less, America ultimately loses, end quote. If we could only increase the number of Latinx in STEM, we could help lift communities out of poverty, like my community back in Colton. I'm sorry to say the overturning of Roe v. Wade will make this even more challenging. One of my ancestors who deeply inspires me and who has tried to address some of the complex problems in my community is my mom's cousin, Dr. Tom Rivera, who grew up in South Colton. For many years, he was an associate dean of undergraduate studies at Cal State San Bernardino. Dr. Rivera served our community with the help of his wife, Dr. Lily Rivera, from the confines of a wheelchair after being paralyzed by a virus when he was 40 years old. He passed away in February of this year. Over the course of his career, he did many things to lift people up. One of these was to co-found the Inland Empire Future Leaders, a program for 8th and 9th graders, which he started in 1985. Because at the time, he said, 54% of Chicanos were dropping out of school. This was when I was in high school. Since its founding, 4,500 students have gone through this program, 99% of which have graduated from high school, and 90% of which have gone to college. Among the alumni of his programs are 2 current members of Congress, one of whom eulogized him on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives. It was really beautiful to know that someone from Congress felt they needed to eulogize and amplify the impact of my cousin, Dr. Rivera, who was a good man who had done so much for so many in our community. In 2019, and my own scholarship, I became curious. And I wanted to know how many Latinx science, math, or computer science teachers are there in California public schools? But I couldn't find this information anywhere. So I started interviewing science teachers, including Gloria Ramirez Haldeman from my old high school. And to investigate this question, I also hired a talented undergraduate science major, Dylan Rainbow, to help me analyze more than 1 million records from the California Department of Education. And here's what we found. First of all, teaching is the top profession for Latinas. And in California, 21% of public school teachers are Latinx across all subjects. However, only 3% out of it, 17% of California teachers who teach science, math, or computer science are Latinx, which is about the same number, 2 to 5%, of Latinx faculty and EEB across all ranks nationally. So I wrote up our findings in an essay that was picked up by a number of media outlets. I was also interviewed about the importance of teachers as role models for an NPR episode that was downloaded more than 500,000 times. As I mentioned earlier, when I was in high school, I held negative stereotypes about myself and also of the humble town of South Colton where my family was from. But just this year, I learned something amazing about Colton. Less than 2 miles from my high school, in this dusty, vacant lot located next to railroad tracks that run alongside a freeway, and next to the cement plant, now closed, where my ancestors worked, some entomologists collected the type specimen of an endemic California butterfly. For those of you who may or may not know, I study butterflies. My mind was blown when I learned this because it totally contradicted my perception about this urban place. And the lesson I learned from this is even in the most desolate-seeming urban spaces, there's precious diversity, both human and non-human. In fact, this is one of the last remaining habitats of a threatened fly, the Delhi sandfly. We, as educators, have a responsibility to nurture what is there and to help people who are drawn to science because of their natural curiosity, despite them not having the stereotypical markers of success. So after I wrote this article, my mother, father, and I, along with a few friends and high school classmates, started a scholarship at my old high school for college-bound seniors. Since 2020, we've awarded 18 scholarships to students, nearly all of whom are low income or very low income and who come from a high school that is now 94% Hispanic and 94% economically disadvantaged. And for a butterfly book I've been researching and writing, I've also endeavored to interview butterfly scientists from diverse backgrounds, such as Jolene Saldivar, who is a first-generation U.S. Air Force veteran and Colton High School alum, and current UC Riverside graduate student who's studying the impact of fire on butterfly host plant communities in Southern California. Despite struggling with poverty in high school, similar to my grandmother and a majority of students attending Colton High School today, and acting out because of it, so her grades were less than stellar, Jolene managed to follow her childhood curiosity about the natural world, obtain 2 Bachelor's of Science degrees, and won a prestigious NSF graduate fellowship to study plant-pollinator interactions. This strong Latina role model, who I'm so proud of, uses the beauty of butterflies to mentor URM students. And in my own lab, I've also endeavored to mentor and support the careers of a number of brilliant scholars. Dr. Aide Macias Munoz is one of them. She is a Latina of Mexican origin, a first-generation English learner who, like my high school classmates, went to public school in California in a low-income district then on to UC Berkeley for university. You can imagine my delight when she was hired as a tenure-track faculty member at UC Santa Cruz in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology this spring, where she will run a lab studying eye evolution and regeneration in cnidarians. Dr. Macias Munoz joins a growing cohort of vibrant Latina faculty members in EEB, but this group, even though they are a dynamic, strong, and inspirational group, are not yet a large enough number of people to serve as role models to the nearly 18.7% of people in the US, is almost 20% of people in the US who identify as Latinx, which is unfortunate since research has shown that having role models, as I've said, has a positive impact on retention in school and is undoubtedly the reason why I became a science professor. There is so much we can do as educators to lift people up. So I want to end with a call to action on behalf of marginalized children, BIPOC children, the children of immigrants who continue to feed us, provide us with food security, clean up after devastating wildfires and floods, tend our gardens, build our houses, and who contribute to the wealth of the US by paying taxes, yet are excluded from healthcare and Social Security. Many of whom are indigenous peoples displaced from their homelands due to intensifying climate change. So here are some of the things that we, as members of ecology and evolutionary biology community, can do to create a more just and diverse scientific workforce. So amplifying some of the ideas that Valeria Ramirez Castaneda shared with us on Sunday morning, we can co-author papers with collaborators from the Global South so as to appropriately acknowledge their expertise and support their careers, including people who collect specimens and who hold relevant permits. We can cite the papers of people in the Global South, even if it's in another language. Remember, we have these wonderful online translation programs. We can participate in 8th grade science programs, especially those targeting girls. We can recruit URM students from community colleges. We can take a chance on students with less than stellar grades. We can pay undergraduates a stipend to do research, and especially we can pay students who want to become science teachers. We can leverage our resources, both material and linguistic, to help teachers by facilitating access to specimens and science materials. Teachers really need our help right now. We need to try to help them. We can also diversify faculty in our own departments via hiring incentives and a willingness to grow your own talent. Even one new faculty member of color makes a difference. There are so many things we can do to open the doors of STEM to people, because I wouldn't be standing up here without all of the help from the teacher role models in my life. The people who took a chance on me, helped amplify my voice, and who've let me have this honor today. I'm so excited to see how we can help others achieve similar things. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions if there are any questions or comments.
Yeah, thank you so much for that talk. I found it super moving and inspiring, and all of the good stuff about. So you mentioned towards the beginning of your talk that, if you had known about your family history earlier, you would have felt more, empowered, in your career and life. And my family's sort of going through a similar process of discovery right now, learning about our ancestors, who are some of the first Chinese people to immigrate to the United States.
So I really started to dig into family history after I survived a cancer diagnosis. So I was diagnosed with cancer in 2014, and I underwent chemotherapy and surgery. And it made me really think about a lot of things. And that really kind of spurred me to look at this more closely. And I realized that because we don't teach a diversity of stories in U.S. history in our public schools. For example, my public school education, we only went up to U.S. history only went up to World War II. So I know absolutely nothing about the Vietnam War, the Korean War, anything else. There was almost nothing taught about Mexican or American history, even though like this is my community. And I struggled with this whole issue of like, why is it so difficult to move people out of these zones of poverty, like and educational attainment? And it really wasn't until I realized that what made it possible for my grandmother and my mother to really escape when most people were not escaping was the fact that they had privilege. Even though they were poor people, they had privilege because my great-great-grandfather was a teacher. He was literate. If you could read and write, that was an extremely rare thing back in those days. And he taught all of his children how to read and write. And when they came to California, they subscribed to the local Spanish language newspapers. And what I didn't mention, but something that I'm interested in following up on, is that he, and I just learned this last year, he actually was a poet. And my mother's cousin shared with me some of his poetry that was about migration. He wrote about Mexican migration from the US. It's kind of mind-boggling, and so I want to share that story because like the example of the museum, like even in a place where like majority Latinx community, you go to the museum and there's like no mention that these are people that have lived there and have contributed to the regional wealth for over 100 years. No mention of it. It's sort of like, why is that? Well, one reason is that that exhibit was put up during the Trump administration. And I think my guess is that that museum had gotten a lot of flack from local people, donors, because they had had an exhibit highlighting the plight of immigrant children being put in cages. It's a guess. I'm trying to cut them slack, but that's kind of a glimpse into my motivation. I don't know if that answers your question entirely. Yeah, yeah, and I'd love to take more questions. I hope people have more questions.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
I'm curious what your thoughts are. You illustrated well some of the sort of systemic and overt and deliberate racism and discrimination that happens regionally and U.S.-wide throughout the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, we're encouraged not, and that has direct effects on students. At the same time, we're encouraged not to apply deficit models towards addressing those problems. And but the practices are sending students to university unprepared, measurably unprepared. Can you reconcile or try to maybe address that? To me, it seems like a challenge because those two points are at odds.
Yeah, I know what you mean about we're not supposed to talk about deficits and things, and I guess for me it's hard to not think about them because I actually think that the deficits in my community have gotten worse. I think poverty is even more pervasive than when I was a high school student, and it deeply distresses me. That's part of the reason why we started this small scholarship program in my high school, because once I started interviewing teachers and they shared with me the demographic and the financial background of the families of the students in the school, I realized, oh my God, it's even way worse. I mean, it's really like, 94% of the students at my high school are eligible for a free or reduced lunch. And, I can't even begin to tell you how difficult it is to get out of poverty in these circumstances. So for example, a related issue is in my community, surrounding areas, Amazon has come in and built millions of square feet of warehouses, and it's like they're extracting the labor from my community. There's even an Amazon classroom in one of the high schools, like where you can just go straight from high school into working for Amazon. So you've got like environmental pollution, you have these jobs that really don't lead anywhere, and the corporations know where to go. And we also have a situation in the Inland Empire where venture capitalists and from Wall Street are bought up like tons of property in the area and are now the property owners, and they're raising rents. So these people, can't even buy houses now. Anyway, so to address your question, so what do you do? I mean, I think that people need a lot of support, to be perfectly honest, like when they make that transition to college. I think that having cohorts of people and having people that understand that, so for example, if you read Anthony Jack's book, The Privileged Poor, he talks about how in spaces like the Ivy Leagues, even if you have students of color from low-income families, the ones that tend to be in the Ivy League, actually, a lot of them went to private high schools on scholarship. So they managed to make it through because they've already had 4 years of socialization in a school environment that's very similar to what they experience when they go to Harvard or wherever. But the experience of kids that go to public school, totally different. They are not socialized at all to deal with the university. And so I think they do need a lot of social support and guidance. And that's why my cousin's program, which continues now, run by volunteers who graduated from that program, is so important because it's community-based, and it's people, reaching back and like helping people to, come through the system that they struggled with. So, yeah, I think we need to support more cohorts and to really address that social dimension. And really, to be honest, one of the things that's helped me the most is learning U.S. Mexican history. If you don't know the history, like you run around thinking, oh my God, what's wrong with my people or whatever, because you're just not understanding like what's going on. In my high school, we had so many girls who were getting pregnant that we had a daycare center, which was great because that gave them the chance to finish high school. That was really important. I am terrified now because of Roe v. Wade being overturned, because that no longer exists in my high school. Okay, so there's no longer a place for the girls to bring their children so that they can take classes and finish high school. So the U.S. is not prepared for what's going to happen. And this was in California, where we had legal abortion and birth control, but in low-income communities with no health insurance, okay? So that was one of the things my cousin did, was he brought in a philanthropic group to do free clinics in my community. And why was that? Well, it's because, no health insurance, right? So these are going to be desperate times, I'm afraid. Sorry to say that. And I'm happy to take more questions. And yeah, thanks. Are you talking about the evolution meetings next year? Is that what you're asking? Our to be president, Kelly Zamudio, is sitting right here. So the question is there ways to bring students, college students, maybe not grad students, to the meeting next year? Are there mechanisms?
Well, there are a number of programs in SSE for support for graduate students, including the UDE program for undergraduate diversity and evolution.
Okay.
It brings a dozen students. That's correct.
Yes. Yeah, I really think that you have to start early. Like you have to start middle school. I think if you target some of your outreach efforts at middle school, that's really important. I think that's really where you get people engaged. When I interviewed Jolene, she talked about. Well, I mean, she had an unusual experience. She started going to medical conferences when she was in middle school because one of her siblings had an illness that was a chronic, life-changing illness. And so she had that early exposure, but it was in middle school. And I think a lot of research supports that. It's kind of an early model. You need to start, drawing people into it. That's why I like this idea of also like sharing teaching materials in Spanish and English. I think that makes a difference to try to also reach out to people who are making that transition. Yes. Uh-huh. So the question is, how do I incorporate my family and my community into my science in a way that makes my science presence more welcoming and so forth. So one thing I've tried to do is leverage my status as a award-winning scientist to be able to write for the public. It's a lot of work and it's hard because it's a different kind of writing. And so, and that's one of the reasons why I'm writing about the history of my family, because I think that a lot of people have had similar experiences. We have millions of people who've come across the border driven by economic reasons, and they come to the U.S. and you can read the history books. The agribusiness owners in California said, we need these workers, bring them in, but don't worry, we're gonna make sure that they leave. Like they're very explicit in the historical record. So there's this intentional, there's intent around making people not ever welcome, or you don't belong here. Like it's been going on for a very long time. So the thing that I try to do, and if you follow me on Twitter, you'll see this, like I try to share historical sources, books, articles that I think, just kind of like shine a light on what are the political and historical processes that have led us to where we are today. And I think without that, you're just really lost in trying to understand what's going on. And so that's something I would really encourage people to do, is to share those resources as well. And I'm happy to share some suggested readings if anyone wants to ask me afterwards as well. Great. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Thank you so much for your compelling
Yeah, SOCNUS is a phenomenal organization. I would really encourage everybody, if your institution does not have a chapter, I would encourage you to, try to encourage the grad students and the undergrads to start one because first of all, when I first went to SOCNAS when I was a grad student, it was a small meeting. It was just a couple hundred people. And when they gave me that award a few years ago, it was a meeting with 4,000 people. And so it was so moving to see the hunger. People want to be scientists and engineers and mathematicians, and it's incredibly inspiring. And some of the things that have given me hope in my own institution, which and only recently became a Hispanic serving institution, was the graduate students who started SACNA. So Aide Macias Munoz, my former grad student who's starting a faculty job at UC Santa Cruz, she was a co-founder of SACNAS at UCI. And I think those are places where it's okay to talk about the history of our communities. And SACNAS is open to not just Native Americans and Chicanos. It is open to anybody who wants to show up. And so that's a place where you can feel comfortable. Like I want to have a speaker talking about the history of Chinese exclusion in the US. There was a lot, I could have talked about that in my talk too, because that was going on in El Paso during the same period my family was crossing the border. That's a really great space to encourage. And also, if you have any institutional leverage, give them some money so that they have, they can invite a speaker or they can, have refreshments. Those organizations are so incredibly powerful and so valuable.
This is just to announce that our diversity committees do have some connections to Stockton, and this is the first year that we will have a Tri-Society Evolution booth at Stockton. So this is going to be a great place to serve as like a meeting point for members of our community to connect with each other. So if you have students who are going to Stockton, if you will be there, please join us. We'd love to have you sit at the booth and help recruit. If you want to talk about strategies for getting to softness and other things like that, they've opened the travel awards for grad students. There's still a deadline in July, and undergrads. So send your people there, because one of the things that we see at softness is there are a number of faculty who from evolutionary biology attending this meeting, but we don't see that many students. And so what we'd like to see is more students there, more of our community, and everybody is welcome. And we're going to really try and continue to build that relationship and get our evolutionary biology research and community present at Soccer.
Great, thank you. All right. Any last questions? Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you for coming to my talk.